There is a cave on the west coast of Scotland where the tide comes in twice a day and swallows the entrance whole. For more than a mile in either direction there is nothing but cliff and cold water, and the kind of silence that makes your own footsteps sound like a warning. The locals have a name for that stretch of coast, and they will point you toward it if you ask, but most of them will not walk it after dark, not because of what is there now, because of what they say was there 400 years ago. A family, not a gang, not a cult, a family, fathers and daughters and sons and cousins, dozens of them, living in the black throat of that cave, coming out only when the roads above were quiet and the travellers were alone. You have seen the story, you just did not know where it came from. When a young filmmaker sat down in the 1970s to write about a family of desert dwellers who hunt stranded travellers for meat, he did not invent them. He reached back into an old and half-forgotten piece of folklore, filed off the accent, moved the whole thing across an ocean. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. And set it loose in the American wasteland. The picture in your head of the backwoods cannibal clan, the inbred family in the hills, the people who look almost human until they open their mouths, that picture has a birthplace, and it is not the Ozarks. It is not Appalachia. It is a windswept headland in a country of castles and rain, and the version they told about that real family for centuries was already monstrous. What almost nobody tells you is that the truth underneath the legend, the thing the legend was built to hide, was worse. That is what this is about, not the movie. The movie is the shadow. This is about the shape that cast it. And by the time we are finished, you are going to understand that the horror was never really the cave, or the meat, or the 45 bodies they say lived down there in the dark. The horror was what a country did with the story afterward, who they blamed, who they hanged for it, and how a legend about eating people became one of the most useful lies a nation ever told about itself. Think about how deep this particular fear runs in you already, before we have even properly begun. The family that lives too far out, the house at the end of the road with the boarded windows, the people who watch you drive past and do not wave. Every one of those images feels ancient and instinctive, as if you were born knowing to be afraid of them. And in a sense you were, because you inherited the fear the way you inherited a language. Passed down and reshaped through generation after generation of storytellers who all borrowed from the same original source without ever naming it. The backwoods cannibal, the mountain family, the clan that farms the highway for flesh. That figure has been rebuilt and repackaged more times than anyone can count, and almost every version of it traces back, if you follow the thread far enough, to one cold coast and one dark cave and one man they called by an insult. Understanding where that fear was manufactured and who profited from manufacturing it is the difference between being frightened by a story and being used by one. Let us go back. To understand how this family became the blueprint for every backwoods nightmare that came after, you have to understand the world they were supposed to have lived in, and you have to understand that this world was already starving. The man at the centre of it has a name, or at least the name the storytellers gave him, Alexander Bean. But nobody remembers him by that. They remember him as Sawney. Sawney was a nickname, a rough and slightly mocking word that the English used for a certain kind of Scotsman, the poor kind, the wild kind, the kind you did not want your daughter marrying. That detail matters more than it looks, and we will come back to it, because the name itself is a clue that this story was not really being told by the people it happened to. It was being told about them by someone else, for a reason. They say he was born in a small village not far from Edinburgh, in the county of East Lothian, sometime in the 1500s. His father was a hedger and a ditcher, which meant he dug the ditches and shaped the hedges that divided one man's field from another. It was the lowest kind of honest work, back-breaking and endless and barely enough to eat on, and it was the work that was waiting for Alexander too. He was expected to pick up the spade the moment his father set it down. And here, in the very first act of the story, you already feel the pressure that runs underneath the whole thing. This was not a boy with options. This was a boy looking at a life of digging other men's ditches in the cold, forever, and understanding that there was no ladder out of it. In the world he was born into, you died roughly where you were born, doing roughly what your father did, and the idea of becoming something else was very close to blasphemy. He decided he was not going to do it. And that decision, ordinary as it sounds, was the first crack. He put down the spade and walked away from the village, and he did not walk alone. There was a woman. The stories call her a hard woman, a vicious woman, a woman as cruel and idle as he was, and you should hear those words the way they were meant, because a woman who refused to work and refused to obey was, to the people telling this tale, already halfway to a monster. Her name in most versions is Agnes Douglas, though like everything else here the name shifts depending on who is doing the telling. What matters is that the two of them left. They turned their backs on the fields and the village and the whole slow, grinding machine of ordinary life, and they went looking for somewhere the machine could not reach them. They found it on the coast of Galloway, in the southwest, at a place the stories call Benane Head, and this is where the geography does half the work of the horror. Picture it, a wall of cliff dropping straight into the sea, a shoreline of broken rock and cold grey water, and set into the base of that cliff, hidden from the land above and drowned twice a day by the tide, the mouth of a cave, not a shallow scrape in the rock. A tunnel. The stories say it ran back into the hillside for the better part of a mile, twisting and branching, with side chambers and dead ends, and a darkness so total that you could stand 10 feet from the entrance and see nothing at all. When the tide came in, the sea sealed the door. When it went out, the door opened again onto a world that had no idea the cave was inhabited. You could search that whole coast for a year and walk past the entrance 100 times and never once think that anything was living inside. And the location was not random, whatever the storytellers wanted you to believe about two idle wretches simply stumbling on a hole in a cliff. If you were going to make a living hunting travellers, this was the place to do it, and that fact tells you something about how carefully the legend was engineered to seem plausible. That coast sat on a route. It was the kind of ground that people had to cross to get from one market town to the next, close enough to the road that a body could be dragged down to the water in minutes, remote enough that no cottage overlooked the spot, and shaped by the tide so that the evidence disposed of itself. A cannibal family in the middle of a busy town is a story that collapses on contact with common sense. A cannibal family tucked into the one blind corner of a trade route, where the traffic was steady but the witnesses were none, is a story that a listener will accept without ever noticing the sleight of hand. Whoever built this legend understood, at some level, exactly how the movement of people and goods actually worked, and they set their monster down at the precise point where that movement was richest and loneliest at the same time. And something was living inside. That is where they made their home. Two people who had refused the only lives on offer, hiding in a hole the ocean opened and closed like a lid, with no money, no land, no trade, and no intention of ever going back to honest work. The problem, of course, was that people who do not work still have to eat. And this is the moment the story turns from a tale of two outcasts into something that has haunted the imagination for 4 centuries. Because the way they solved the problem of eating was to decide that the travellers on the road above were not people, they were livestock. It started, they say, with robbery. That part is almost mundane. The roads of 16th century Scotland were lonely, dangerous places, and a lone rider or a family on foot was easy prey for anyone desperate enough. So the two of them would climb up out of the cave at dusk and wait in the gorse and the shadow, and when someone passed who looked like they were carrying anything worth taking, they took it. But robbery has a flaw. If you are the kind of person who has decided to live this way, a robbery leaves a witness. And a witness walks to the next town and describes your face, and then there are men with dogs and torches combing the coast, and your hidden life is over. So they solved that flaw the way the whole rest of the story is solved. They stopped leaving witnesses. The first killing is the one that changes a person, or so we like to believe. After that, the stories suggest, it got easier. And then it got worse in a way that is hard to even say out loud, because once there was a body, and the body was in a place where no one could find it, and there was no food, and winter was coming down off the sea, the two of them looked at the dead traveller and made a decision that most human beings, even starving ones, will not make. they ate. And having eaten once, and having survived, and having found that the sea kept their secret, and the cave kept their secret, and the tide washed away everything they threw into it, they simply kept going, not out of some grand evil design, out of the flat, animal logic of it. The road provided, the cave concealed, and the meat, God help them, was already there. Now hold that image, and let it grow, because the truly disturbing part of the legend is not the first murder. It is time. It is the sheer, patient span of years the story asks you to accept. Because Alexander and Agnes did not stay too. Down there in the dark, cut off from every other human being, with no priest and no law and no neighbours and no shame, they had children. And their children, having no one else in the world, had children with each other. And those children did the same. The story says the family grew across 25 years into a clan of somewhere around 45 people. 8 sons, 6 daughters, 18 grandsons, 14 granddaughters. Numbers that get repeated with such confidence in the old accounts that they start to sound like a census, and we will have a great deal to say later about why a secret cannibal family living in total isolation would come with a tidy, itemized head count. But hold the number for now, 45 people. An entire second society, born and raised in a cave, who had never in their lives seen a town, never spoken to a stranger they did not intend to kill, never known that the things they did in the dark were things at all. To them it was simply Tuesday. It was simply how you lived. You went up to the road, you brought back the day's supply, and you fed the family. And they fed the family for years. Some versions say a decade, some say 25 years. 25 years of pulling travellers off that road, 1 and 2, and sometimes a whole party at a time, dragging them down into the cave, and never, in all that time, being caught. Which brings us to the question the legend loves to skip past, and the question that starts to pull the whole thing apart if you sit with it. How? How does a coastline lose that many people and no one notices? This is where the economic reality of the age stops being background and starts being the actual engine of the horror. And this is where the story gets genuinely worse than the version you will hear in a scary campfire retelling. Because in the world we live in, if hundreds of travellers vanished on one stretch of road over 2 decades, there would be an investigation, there would be records, there would be a pattern on a map that any constable could see. But that is our world. In their world, the machinery that would catch such a thing simply did not exist, and understanding why is the difference between a ghost story and a genuine window into how terrifying ordinary life used to be. Consider what a traveller actually was in that century. Roads were not owned or watched or lit. There was no force whose job it was to patrol them. A person setting out from one town to another might be gone for days or weeks with no way to send word ahead, and their arrival was not expected on any particular day. If they never arrived at all, the assumption was not murder, the assumption was the road. The road killed people constantly. It killed them with weather, with rivers in flood, with fevers caught in bad inns, with falls from horses, with ordinary bandits who left the bodies where they fell. It killed them with wolves, which still roamed that country then. A missing traveller was not a mystery. A missing traveller was Tuesday for everyone, not just for the family in the cave. People disappeared on the roads of Scotland so routinely that the disappearance of hundreds more, spread across 25 years and blamed on all the ordinary causes, would not have registered as a single connected event. There was no one whose job it was to connect it. To really feel how this was possible, you have to strip out everything you assume about travel and rebuild it from the ground up, because the economy of movement in that age was almost nothing like ours, and the legend feeds directly on the gap. There was no register of who set out and who arrived. There was no ticket, no manifest, no waybill for a human being, no central office where a person's journey was recorded at one end and confirmed at the other. A man walked or rode from where he was to where he wanted to be, and the only proof he had gone was that people saw him go, and the only proof he had arrived was that people saw him arrive, and if those two sets of people never compared notes, and they almost never did, then a man could simply cease to exist between one town and the next and leave no hole in any ledger anywhere. Movement itself was invisible to the record, and a monster that feeds on the invisible is a monster that can eat forever. Now consider who was actually on those roads. because this is where the economics gets genuinely revealing. The traveller was not a tourist. The traveller was the economy in motion. He was the drover walking cattle to market with the price of a herd sewn into his coat. He was the packman carrying needles and ribbon and small goods from village to village, a walking shop with coin in every pocket. He was the merchant riding to settle a debt, the rent collector carrying a landlord's silver, the messenger with letters that were themselves worth money, the tradesman moving to where the work was. In a world before banks reached into every town, before paper money, before any of the machinery we use to move value without moving a body, wealth travelled the way people travelled, on foot and on horseback, along the same lonely roads, carried in purses and saddlebags by the very people the family was pulling into the dark. Every murder on that coast was not just a death. It was a small economic event, a quantity of coin and goods and labour and unpaid debt vanishing out of the district's bloodstream, and the strangest, the most chilling detail of the whole affair is that this steady bleeding of money and men could go on for a generation and register to the people living through it as nothing more than the ordinary bad luck of a hard road. And here is the part that should genuinely unsettle you, because it is where the legend stops being about cannibalism and starts being about how a whole society hides its own wounds from itself. When a drover failed to come home, his family did not suspect a cave. They suspected he had been robbed and dumped in a ditch, which happened, or that he had drunk his takings and run off, which also happened, or that he had simply died of the road, which happened most of all. When a packman stopped appearing on his circuit, the villages he served did not raise an alarm. They assumed he had moved on, or fallen ill, or been killed by common thieves, and they found another packman. When a debt went unpaid because the man carrying the money never arrived, it was written down as a loss and folded into the price of the next transaction, and life went on. Each disappearance was absorbed, quietly, locally, economically, into the general hum of a world where losing people was normal. Nobody kept the running total. The family did not have to hide the bodies from an investigation, because there was no investigation. They only had to hide them from the tide, and the tide was happy to help. And there is a darker economic layer underneath even that, and it is the layer the legend was built to bury. When people go missing, someone has to be blamed, because a frightened population demands an answer, and the powerful must be seen to provide one. And in that century, when travellers stopped arriving in a district, suspicion did not fall on a hidden cave that no one knew existed. It fell on the last people known to have seen the missing alive. It fell on the innkeepers. Think about the position of the innkeeper on a dangerous road. He is the last door a traveller passes through before vanishing into the dark. He knows they had money because he watched them pay for their bed. He knows which way they were headed. And when they never turn up at the far end, and their family comes looking, and the trail goes cold, the finger points straight back at the man who served them their last meal. The stories tell us, almost in passing, as if it is a minor detail, that during the years the Bean family fed on that road, a number of innkeepers along that coast were arrested, tried, and executed, hanged, for murders they did not commit, because the real murderers were living in a cave that no one would find for a quarter of a century. Sit with that for a moment, because it is the part the horror films always leave out. The monsters in the cave did not only kill the travellers, they killed the innocent men who got blamed for it. Every innkeeper who swung from a rope for a crime he never committed was a second victim of a family he never knew existed. The legend gives you 45 cannibals and a horrifying number of eaten travellers. The reality the legend gestures at, almost by accident, is a justice system so blind and so hungry for a culprit that it fed its own honest men into the noose to keep the story tidy. That is worse than the cave. That is the machinery of the whole society failing and calling the failure justice. And it kept working, that machinery, precisely because it produced answers. An innkeeper hanged is an answer. It calms the district. It lets the roads reopen. It lets commerce resume. And commerce, in that age, is the thing everyone is really protecting. Because a road where travellers vanish is not just a tragedy, it is an economic wound. Merchants will not carry goods along it. Traders will route around it, adding days and cost to every journey. A coast that earns a reputation for swallowing people is a coast that dies, its markets starved, its towns cut off. So there was enormous pressure that had nothing to do with truth and everything to do with money, to explain the disappearances quickly, blame someone plausible, execute them publicly, and declare the road safe again. The legend of the Bean family, whether it happened exactly as told or not, sits right on top of that pressure. It is the story of a horror so well hidden that the society around it kept solving the wrong crime over and over, hanging the wrong men, reopening the deadly road, and sending fresh travellers straight back into the dark. For 25 years, so the story goes, it held. And then, as these things do, it broke on a single night, over a single mistake. It was a fair, a market fair in one of the coastal towns, the kind of gathering that pulled people in from miles around to buy and sell and drink and celebrate, and then scattered them back out along the dark roads home in ones and twos. A man and his wife were riding back from that fair, sharing one horse, the wife seated behind her husband. And on that lonely stretch above the cave, the family came out of the shadows the way they always did, all at once, silent, swarming. They dragged the wife off the back of the horse. And here the story becomes genuinely, physically horrifying in a way the numbers never manage, because it tells us they killed her right there in front of him, and in their frenzy, in full view of her husband, they cut her open and began to feed. Not later, in the cave, there, on the road, in the mud, with her husband watching. But this husband was not a soft man, and he was not alone in the wider world, and those two facts are what finally cracked the legend open. He was armed, he was mounted, and he was a skilled and desperate fighter, and he understood in an instant that he was already dead if he stopped moving, so he did not stop moving. He drove the horse forward through the pack of them, trampling and slashing. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. Using the animal's weight and his own blade to carve a path, and by some miracle of terror and momentum he broke through the ring of hands and got clear. And then, the crucial detail, the thing that had never happened in 25 years, he got away. He rode. For the first time in the entire span of the family's reign, a witness escaped the road above the cave, and he rode straight into town carrying the one thing the family had always prevented from leaving that shoreline. He carried the truth. And by the sheerest luck, or the sheerest design of the storytellers, he did not ride into the arms of some village constable who might have shrugged and blamed the road. As it happened, a larger party from the fair came upon the aftermath, and the man's account, wild and blood-soaked and impossible as it sounded, reached ears that could actually do something about it. It reached, the legend says, all the way to the king. This is the point where the story swells from a local horror into a national event, and it is also, not coincidentally, the point where the storytellers reach for the biggest name they can find, because a legend needs a king in it to feel true. The king in question is James VI of Scotland, the same man who would later become James I of England and put his name on the most famous Bible in the language. And the story tells us that James did not send a magistrate. He came himself. He raised a force of 400 men, and he brought bloodhounds, and he rode down to that coast to hunt the thing on the road personally. Now picture the search, because the search is where the geography takes its revenge on the hunters. 400 men and a pack of dogs, sweeping a coastline of cliff and gorse and broken rock, and finding nothing. Nothing. They went past the cave again and again, the same way every traveller had for 25 years, and saw only a black slit in the base of a cliff, half drowned by the tide, leading, as far as anyone could tell, nowhere. The cave had hidden the family from the world for a generation, and it very nearly hid them from the king. If not for the dogs, it might have. But the dogs, so the story goes, caught something on the wind near the cave mouth, some scent bleeding out of that darkness that no cliff and no tide could wash away entirely, and they went wild. They would not leave the entrance. And the men, following the dogs, lit their torches and went in. Whether or not any of it happened, the story understands exactly how to make the descent unbearable, and it is worth walking it the way the legend does, because the craftsmanship of the fear is itself part of the evidence that someone built this very carefully. Picture the first men through the mouth of the cave, stooping under the low rock, torches guttering in the wet air, the sound of the sea booming behind them and then falling away as the tunnel swallowed it, the light reaching only a few feet in every direction and the dark closing up again the moment they passed. Picture the smell reaching them before the sight did, because that is how the story tells it, a smell that told them what this place was before their eyes could confirm it, thick and animal and wrong, the smell of a butcher's yard that had never once been cleaned. Picture the floor underfoot growing soft in a way stone should not, and the men not letting themselves look down. And picture the moment a torch was lifted and the light finally caught the wall, and what hung there resolved out of the dark into shapes that a human mind refuses, at first, to name. The legend paces this like a horror film 3 centuries before horror films existed, and that alone should make you suspicious. Real discoveries are chaotic and confused and badly remembered. This one unfolds with the perfect, dreadful timing of a thing designed to be told and retold around a fire, each beat placed exactly where it will land hardest. What they found in there is the heart of the legend, the image that 400 years of retelling has polished into something unforgettable, and it is worth describing plainly, without the theatrics, because the plain version is bad enough. They followed the tunnel back into the hill, deeper than anyone had imagined it could go, and as they went, the walls began to tell them what lived there. Hanging from the rock, the story says, were human limbs. Arms and legs, cured and dried, and strung up like meat in a butcher's shop or a farmer's larder, hung to keep through the winter. There were bundles of clothing, the belongings of the vanished, sorted and piled. There were heaps of money and watches and rings and buckles, the accumulated wealth of 25 years of murder, worthless to a family that never spent it, piling up in the dark like a dragon's hoard. And there were pickled things, remains preserved in brine, packed away in the cold for later. A pantry. That is the word the horror keeps circling back to. They had built a pantry, and they had stocked it with people. And at the back of it, in the deepest dark, was the family itself. 45 of them, the story says, blinking in the torchlight, a second human line that had grown up entirely underground, feral and inbred, and utterly without any understanding that what they had done was wrong, because wrong was a concept from a world they had never entered. They did not surrender quietly, but 400 armed men in a confined tunnel is not a fight, it is a foregone conclusion, and the family was taken alive, all of them, bound and dragged up out of the cave into a daylight most of them had barely ever seen, and marched away to answer for 2.5 decades of the road. Here the legend does something that, once you notice it, you cannot unnotice, and it is the thread that begins to unravel the whole tapestry. It does not give them a trial. It says quite openly that they were considered so far beyond the human that a trial would have been an insult, a waste of the law's dignity, and so they were simply condemned, marched to the city, and put to death in a manner designed to match, or to try to match, the horror of what they had done. The men, the story says, were mutilated and left to bleed to death. The women and children were burned alive in great fires, in sight of the men, so that the last thing the family saw was itself ending. And they say the family showed no repentance to the very end, cursing and screaming, not because they were brave, but because they had never once been taught that there was anything to repent for. That is the legend. That is the story that crossed an ocean and became 100 films. The family in the hills, the pantry of human meat, the clan that looks back at your torchlight with no fear and no shame and no soul. And if we stopped there, it would be one of the great horror stories of the Western world, and you would leave with a shudder and a locked door and nothing more. But we are not going to stop there, because everything I have just told you may be a lie, and the truth of why it was invented, and what it was invented to do, is the part that should actually keep you up at night. Start with the simplest problem, the one that a historian notices in the first 10 minutes, and that the storytellers never want you to sit with. There is no record. For an event that supposedly involved a personal expedition by the King of Scotland, 400 armed men, the discovery of hundreds of murders, and one of the most gruesome mass executions in the nation's history, there is not a single contemporary account. No court record, no royal document, no church register noting the sudden absence of an entire district's worth of missing travellers, no town chronicle, nothing. An event of that magnitude does not happen in a literate, record-keeping, deeply religious society and leave no trace at all. Kings did not raise armies quietly. Executions of that scale were public spectacles that got written down, argued about, moralized over in sermons for years, and for the Bean family there is silence. The silence is not evidence that it was covered up. The silence is evidence that, in the form the legend gives us, it very likely never happened at all. So where does the story actually come from? Follow it backward, and it does not lead to a Scottish courtroom or a royal warrant. It leads to print shops. It leads to cheap pamphlets and broadsheets, and, above all, to a set of publications that first appeared long after the events were supposed to have taken place, in the century that followed, and not in Scotland. In England, the earliest surviving versions of the story show up in English popular print, in the kind of lurid, mass-produced crime literature that people bought for a penny to be thrilled and disgusted on a slow afternoon. And, the most influential of these, the collection that fixed the story in the public mind, was a work that gathered up the lives of notorious criminals for entertainment. This was not history. This was the true crime industry of its day, and like the true crime industry of our own day, it never let the absence of facts get in the way of a story that sold. And that phrase, a story that sold, is not a throwaway. It is the whole key. Because the legend of the cannibal family was, first and last, a product. It was manufactured, printed, priced, and distributed, and it made money for the people who produced it, and it made more money the more monstrous it became. A pamphlet about a man who robbed a coach was worth a penny. A pamphlet about a family that bred with itself for a generation in a sea cave and cured human arms like ham was worth a great deal more, because horror is a commodity and scarcity drives its price, and nothing was scarcer or more thrilling than this. The men who ran these presses were not historians, and they were not moralists, whatever pious lessons they tacked onto the final page. They were businessmen selling fear by the sheet, and they had every commercial reason on earth to exaggerate, to invent, to sharpen every edge of the story until it cut deep enough to empty a stranger's pocket. When you understand that the tale was a thing sold for profit, the impossible details stop being evidence and start being marketing. The 45 family members, the mile-long cave, the personal intervention of a king, the limbs on the walls, these are not the load-bearing facts of a real event. They are the features of a bestseller, added and polished by people whose living depended on you being unable to put the pamphlet down. Now ask the question that changes everything. Why would English print shops, decades or a century after the fact, invest so much energy in a story about a monstrous Scottish family, a story with no records behind it, and make that family as savage, as animal, as inhuman as language could make them? And here we come back to the name, Sawney. Remember that Sawney was not really a name, it was a slur. It was the word the English used for the archetypal Scotsman, poor, filthy, backward, violent, barely civilized, a figure of contempt and mockery in English popular culture. To call the monster Sawney was to tell the English reader, before the story even began, exactly what kind of creature this was and where it came from. The cannibal in the cave was not just a man who ate people. He was Scotland itself, as the English wished to see it. Wild, lawless, living in a hole, breeding with its own children, a land so savage it produced not criminals but a whole hidden line of them. This is where the phrase revisionist history stops being an insult and starts being a tool, because to see the legend clearly you have to be willing to revise the entire frame. The story was never really about a family. It was propaganda, and it arrived, not by coincidence, right around the era when England and Scotland were being pushed and pulled into a single kingdom, when a great many English people were deeply uneasy about being bound to a poorer, wilder country to the north, and when it was politically useful to circulate the idea that the Scots were, at bottom, barely human. A story like this does a very specific job. It takes a whole nation's worth of anxiety and contempt and packs it into one unforgettable image, and it launders that contempt as a mere horror story, a bit of fun, a penny dreadful. Nobody reading it thought they were consuming political propaganda. They thought they were being scared. That is exactly why it worked. The best propaganda never announces itself. It just makes you feel something about a group of people and lets you forget where the feeling came from. And once you understand that the story was a tool, the tidy census of the family stops being a chilling detail and starts being a tell. 8 sons, 6 daughters, 18 grandsons, 14 granddaughters. That is not how survivors of a secret massacre remember a horde of feral cave dwellers glimpsed by torchlight. That is how a writer builds a fake document to make an invented story feel researched. The specificity is not proof of truth. It is a costume that lies where to look like facts. The same instinct that puts a suspiciously exact number in a modern viral post that has no source behind it is the instinct that gave the family its perfect, unverifiable head count. The number is there to make you stop asking questions, not to answer them. So if the legend is propaganda dressed as horror, does that make the whole thing harmless, a mere slander with no body count? No. And this is the final turn, the one that makes the real story genuinely worse than the legend, worse than any cave, worse than any pantry of cured limbs. Because the legend, monstrous as it is a fantasy of contained evil. It tells you the horror was one family, in one cave, on one coast, and that a king and 400 good men rode down and burned it out of the world, and that afterward the roads were safe and the story was over. It is, underneath all the blood, a comforting story. It says evil is rare and foreign and easily located and cleanly destroyed. The truth of that century is the opposite of comforting, because the real horror was not one hidden family. It was the ordinary, documented, everyday brutality of the world the legend was pretending to be worse than. This was an age of recurring famine, when harvests failed and whole regions genuinely starved, and there are real, sober historical accounts, not penny dreadfuls, of desperate people during the worst of these famines, resorting to things no one wants to imagine, simply to survive one more winter. The cannibalism the legend serves up as the mark of a monstrous inhuman clan was, in its rare and tragic real appearances, the act of ordinary starving families abandoned by everyone who should have fed them. The legend takes a horror born of poverty and injustice and hands it to a cartoon villain, so that you will fear the villain and never once ask why the poor were starving. And the starving was not a rare accident of nature that no one could have prevented. It was, over and over across that era, a failure of the same machinery we have been circling all along, the machinery of who gets fed and who gets forgotten. There were years in that country remembered afterwards simply as the ill years, when the harvest failed again and again, and the rain would not stop, and the grain rotted in the fields, and a real, uncounted portion of the population of whole districts died, not in some distant wilderness, but in cottages, a short walk from grain stores that were kept locked, from ports where food was being shipped out even as people starved, from tables where the well-off ate as they always had. People walked to the towns to beg and lay down in the streets and did not get up. That is documented. That is real. That happened in the daylight, in the open, in front of everyone. And it was met not with an army of 400 men and a pack of dogs, but with a shrug, a sermon, and a decision that the market must be allowed to do what the market does. The Cannibal in the Cave is a story you are permitted to be horrified by. The far larger horror of a society that let its own people starve within sight of food is a story that was never printed on a penny sheet, because there was no villain in it you could safely hate, only a system that the people buying the pamphlets were part of. And the executions. The legend gives you a mass execution of the guilty and asks you to cheer, or at least to feel that justice, however grim, was done. But turn your eyes just slightly, off the fictional family and onto the real record of that age, and you find mass executions everywhere, and the people dying in them were overwhelmingly not cannibals. They were the accused. They were the poor woman blamed when the crops failed, dragged out and drowned or burned as a witch. They were, as the legend itself admits in that one throwaway line, the innkeepers, the honest men hanged to close a case and reopen a road. The real machinery of that world executed the innocent constantly, publicly, and with a clear conscience. and it did so to protect commerce and calm the powerful and provide a frightened population with someone to blame. Look hard at the witch trials that ran through exactly this period, and you see the same engine turning, stripped of its cave and its cannibalism and laid bare. When a village suffered, when the cattle sickened or the milk soured or a child died or the crops came in short, the people did not sit with the unbearable truth that suffering is often random and no one is to blame. They found someone, usually a woman, usually poor, usually old, usually alone, usually the one person in the district least able to defend herself and least likely to be missed. And they built a story around her, a story with a monster in it, and they extracted a confession with pain, and they killed her, and afterward the village felt better, because it had located its horror in a single body and destroyed that body, and could tell itself the danger was gone. That is the identical shape as the legend we have been tracing, a community in fear, a convenient monster, a public killing, a false sense of safety purchased with an innocent life. The cannibal family is simply the witch panic told at the scale of a whole nation, with the poor wild Scot standing in for the poor lonely woman, and the same reassuring lie underneath it all, that evil is a thing other people are, and never a thing we do. The legend is a story about a justice system triumphantly catching the real monsters. The history it sits on top of is a justice system that almost never caught the real anything, and killed the wrong people instead, by the thousand, and called it order. That is the thing the movies could never film, because you cannot put it in a cave and light it with a torch. The scariest part of the whole story is not the family. It is that the family probably never existed, and that a whole civilization found it easier to believe in 45 inbred cannibals in a hole than to look honestly at what it was actually doing to its own poor, its own accused, its own honest innkeepers, out in the open, in the daylight, with the full blessing of the law. The legend was a place to put the horror so that no one had to see where the horror really lived. It lived in the famine that the powerful let happen. It lived in the courts that hanged the convenient. It lived in the roads that everyone knew were deadly, and that trade demanded stay open anyway, feeding traveller after traveller into a darkness that the authorities preferred to explain with a story rather than a solution. And that is how the tale travelled. It moved through the cheap print of one century into the folklore of the next, and every generation kept it not because it was true, but because it was useful and thrilling, and it let them feel the delicious, safe fear of a monster that was always someone else, somewhere else, some other kind of person than themselves. It crossed the ocean with the settlers, and it soaked into the new country's own anxieties, its own fear of the wilderness and the backwoods and the isolated families living too far from town and too far from God, out past where the law could reach. The Scottish cave became the American hills. The slur became the nameless clan in the woods. And when the filmmakers came looking for something to frighten a modern audience, the old propaganda was still lying there, still potent, still doing its ancient job of teaching you to fear the poor and the isolated and the different, and they picked it up and pointed a camera at it and called it fiction. And once it was on film, it multiplied. The family in the desert became the family in the swamp, became the family behind the gas station, became the clan up the mountain road, became a whole genre that a modern audience consumes without ever once wondering where the template came from. The details change with each retelling. The setting moves from cave to farmhouse to forest. The weapons change, the decade changes, the accent changes, but the bones underneath are always the same bones, carried unbroken all the way from a penny pamphlet about a Scot with an insult for a name, and they always carry the same quiet instruction, the instruction that was baked into the very first version. Fear the people who live out past the edge of the map. Fear the families that kept to themselves. Fear the poor in their isolated places, because poverty and distance have made them into something no longer quite human. It is one of the oldest and most useful lies the comfortable have ever told about the desperate, and we have been paying money to be frightened by it, in one costume or another, for 400 years, without ever noticing that the monster in the story and the victims of the real history were, all along, the very same people. But it was never really fiction, and it was never really about a family. It was about who a society decides to call a monster, and who it quietly destroys while everyone is looking the other way. The 45 cannibals in the cave are a nightmare you can wake up from. The world that invented them, The famines it allowed, the innocents it hanged, the roads it kept deadly for the sake of the ledger, and the comfort it took in believing that all its horror lived in one hole in one cliff on one lonely coast. That is the nightmare that does not end when the torches go out. That is the one worth remembering. Not the legend, the reason the legend was needed. Because in the end, follow every thread of this story back and they all tie to the same knot, and the knot is money. The road stayed open because trade demanded it, and trade demanded it even though everyone knew the road took people, because a closed road is a dead economy, and a dead economy is a threat. The powerful feel in their own pockets in a way they never feel a poor stranger's disappearance. The innkeepers were hanged because a hanging reopened the road and reassured the merchants and let the coin start flowing again, and a false answer that restores commerce is, to the people who run things, better than a true answer that would leave the danger unexplained. The famines were allowed because feeding the starving would have meant interrupting the flow of grain to the places that could pay for it. And the legend itself was printed and sold and carried around the world because fear is one of the most reliable products a human being can be sold, and this particular fear had the added commercial virtue of pointing away from the men making the money and toward the poor, the foreign, the isolated, the ones with no press of their own to answer back. At every single stage, from the road to the gallows to the printing house to the cinema, someone was protecting a flow of money, and the horror we remember, the cave and the limbs and the 45, is the decoy they left in the light so you would never look at the ledger in the dark. Go and stand on that coast today, if you ever get the chance. The cave is still there. The tide still comes in twice a day and seals the door and opens it again, the same as it did 400 years ago, indifferent to every story anyone has ever told about it. Stand at the mouth of it and listen, and you will hear the water and the wind and nothing else. There are no cured limbs on the walls. There is no hoard of stolen watches. There probably never was. But the emptiness of that cave is not a relief. It is the most disturbing thing about the whole affair. You come all this way expecting to feel the residue of an old evil, some cold breath off the rock, and instead you find only an ordinary sea cave, wet and unremarkable, the kind of place a child might explore on a summer afternoon and forget by supper. And that ordinariness is the real horror, because it forces you to understand that the terror you carried down to this coast was never waiting here for you. You brought it with you. It was handed to you by people you never met, printed on paper you never saw, for reasons that had nothing to do with your safety and everything to do with someone else's profit. The dread is real. The cave is empty. And the distance between those two facts is exactly the size of the lie, because it means the monster was never in there at all. The monster was in the telling. The monster was in the need to have a monster. And that particular monster, the one that lives in a nation's need to point at someone poorer and stranger and further out in the dark and say, there, that is where the evil is, not here, never here, that one was never captured and never burned, and never, in 400 years, has anyone gone looking for it with 400 men and a pack of dogs. And the most honest thing anyone can tell you about that lonely road is that it was never the cave you needed to fear. It was the story about the cave and the quiet arithmetic of who profits when a frightened people are handed a monster to hate. It is still out there on the road, it always has been, and it is still hungry,